Yes.
I'm going to move on to 1989 now, and we can see from a letter that Dr. Gunson wrote to Dr. Smith at the DHSS, which we don't need to turn up for the transcript, is NHBT 5014_033. He wrote a letter on the 6th of January 1989 that as a result of the Chiron, what came to be known the Hepatitis C test, coming online, that he was suggesting that 1,000 of the samples from the multi-centre surrogate testing trial, so 1,000 of those samples where the samples either had raised ALT or anti-Hcv results, should be tested against the new Chiron test. And he describes that as an excellent opportunity for the trial. Can we then turn, please, to NHBT 5043_002, which is a minute of a meeting on 24 February 1989 of the UK Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Diseases. And if we look at the second page, we can see that Dr. Gunson is an attendee. And then if we turn over, please, to the fifth page, under non-A, non-B hepatitis, Dr. Contreras outlined the results of the study in England and Wales. So that, as I understand it, is the study we've just been talking about, surrogate testing study. And then if we go down to 7.4, it was agreed that there should be no recommendation to institute ALT testing until the current study was completed in England. However, there was a degree of inevitability about the introduction of the test, which was required by regulatory authorities in other countries to determine the acceptability of fractionated plasma products. This would be discussed with BPL in the near future. And so the position then in February 1989 was no decision now, but inevitable that surrogate testing will be brought in. Of course, we know ultimately it wasn't, except in limited circumstances. I'm going to come to that in a moment. Helpful to look perhaps at the statement, at what Professor Dr. Gunson says about this in his statement for the hepatitis litigation. We have NHBT 5026_009. And can we go to page 27 of that, please? He makes the point there, paragraph 66. I do not believe that the MBTS should have introduced surrogate testing for non-A, non-B, whether by screening for raised ALT levels or for anti-HBC at any time between 88 and 91. And he goes on to say, I do not believe that recipients of blood or blood products derived from donors who had been so screened, whether in the UK or in the Netherlands or any other countries, which decided not to introduce such screening, were receiving a product which was less safe than they were entitled to expect. There was, however, surrogate screening brought in a limited respect, and that was referred to by Ms. Richards yesterday, and she gave you the references but didn't take you to the documents, but I'm going to do that. So could we look at the first one, NHBT 5027_011. So this is a letter. This is a letter from to Dr. Gunson from, if we go over the page, from Dr. Cash, dated the 12th of January 1990. And go back over to the first page, please. ALT donation testing, plasmapheresis donations. A chance conversation with Marcela Contreras has revealed that a policy decision has been made requiring all NBTS RTCs to commence routine ALT donation testing of plasmapheresis donations on 1st April 1990. And then the next paragraph, second sentence, we were both conscious of our and SNBTS published professional views on the matter, and the subsequent assurances we gave you that Scotland would not introduce any form of routine surrogate non-A, non-B donation testing unless it was a joint UK exercise and one which, like HIV-1 donation testing, had ministerial approval. And he goes on to say, on the assumption that Marcella's news is correct, I wonder where that leaves us all. I suggest with the deepest and most profound regret that it looks as though the NBTS and SNBTS must go their separate ways in regard to quality assurance. I would have thought that with all the emerging litigation associated with blood and blood products, particularly against the background of the new product liability laws, this must surely have signalled the beginning of something so desperately needed for the last 30 years, coming together on policy and operational matters of the NBTS and SNBTS. And the reply from Dr. Gunson, which we find at NHBT 5027_012, dated the 16th of January 1990, and he says, the second sentence of the first paragraph, I honestly thought you knew all about this development since it was discussed at the Transfusion Transmitted Diseases Committee, where I recall I said that we were under considerable pressure to perform ALT testing for the production of IVIG, immunoglobulin. You will recall also that you and I discussed in some detail the report that was sent to the DOH on anti-Hcv testing, and that after some difficulty we agreed the recommendation, which appears at item 7.5, viz, and then he quotes from the report, the routine introduction of non-specific tests should be deferred unless this is necessary for the acquisition of product licenses in the UK for fractionated plasma products. It is the intention of the committee to keep this topic under close review. The purpose of the present testing is just for this reason. BPL wished to obtain a licence for IVIG production, and the licence requires the plasma to be ALT tested. We are restricting the testing to plasma collected by apheresis because of the implications of ALT testing all blood donations. So it would appear that there was some limited testing, surrogate testing of some plasma for commercial reasons for BPL. I'm going to move on now to hepatitis C testing. I'm going to start by looking at PRSE 302340. So this is a letter dated the 18th of August 1989 to all RTDs, and it is from Dr. Gunson. And then he says that this third paragraph down, where he says in the second paragraph he's forgotten to mention some issues about policy aspects about anti-HIV 1 and 2 and anti-Hcv. And he says in the third paragraph, it's important that we act in a coordinated manner nationally and also with Scotland with the introduction of these tests with respect to the routine screening of donations. There will have to be approval of the DH before they are introduced, and the means of obtaining this is the agreement of the DH's Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood, next meeting 17th of October 1989. And then he goes on at the bottom of that page to say that the anti-Hcv is being evaluated in North London and the Glasgow transfusion centres. But what he says, the reason for the letter is right at the bottom of that first page, there are many aspects to clarify before routine testing can commence, although I think it would be prudent to include the cost of this test as, and then we go over the page, a development in your budgets for 1990-1991. So the expectation is at that stage that RHAs, regional health authorities, will have to find some money for routine testing of hepatitis, or of donations for hepatitis C. We can then pick it up, please, at NHBT 0305043, which is a meeting of the advisory ACVSB on the 16th of November 1989. And this is in Dr. Gunson's oral evidence for the A and others litigation. This he describes as the point, the meeting at which the decision was made to introduce testing for hepatitis C in principle. So if we can look, please, at page 4. And we see under non-A, non-B hepatitis, paragraph 23, that Dr. Gunson speaks to a paper, and he says there, the conclusions of the BTS committee were that the test would detect a viral marker to non-A, non-B. A positive test may mean blood is infected, but not always, and that routine testing for anti-HCV will reduce non-A, non-B, but estimates to the extent of the reduction range from 20 to 60%. Problems are lack of a confirmatory test, question mark hanging over the status of the ALT and anti-HBC testing. Recommendations are that routine screening should be introduced only after a confirmatory test becomes available. It's the first condition. Secondly, after the FDA have approved the test. And thirdly, urgent pilot studies have been carried out in this country. And then if we go down to paragraph 26, we can see what Dr. Metters from the department was saying. He explained that although the department must bear in mind the possible litigation that could arise from a prolonged delay in the introduction of general screening, the NHS Management Executive would want to know more facts and figures before backing such a move. And then if we go over to paragraph 28 on the following page, the feeling of the committee, as summed up by the chairman, was that the test represented a major step forward, but that the committee needed to know a great deal more about it and acknowledged the need for a confirmatory test. It was agreed that while the UK would not want to go in advance of an FDA decision, it could prove difficult if the FDA did not decide in favour of the test. Nevertheless, it was felt that if the UK do put the test into general use, RTCs will need to have had experience with it, and therefore pilot studies should go on in Birmingham, Sheffield and Brentwood to show the feasibility of adding this test to routine practice. And then in the following paragraph, the committee comes to the view that there's no case for surrogate testing. So that was the position in November 1990. And the report that Dr. Gunson spoke to, and we don't need to go to that, but just for the transcript, it's NHBT 40188_072. So the requirement there for FDA approval, Food and Drug Administration in America, approval of the tests is an issue that we see returned to in the papers. And Dr. Gunson gave some evidence about that in his oral evidence for the A and others hepatitis C litigation. If we could just turn that up, it's NHBT 40148_001. If we could go, we can see, just see from the first page that this is the oral evidence he gave on Thursday, the 26th of October 2000, and he's been cross-examined by Mr. Brown, counsel for the defendants. And if we go, please, to page 26 of that, we can see what he says about FDA approval. So if we start, please, at line 1285. In fact, 1280, let's start at with Mr. Justice Burton. Mr. Justice Burton, why did you need to wait for the US domestic test to be done when it seemed the FDA regarded it as sufficient to allow you to have it, on the understanding you would carry out your own tests, which you were perfectly capable of doing? Answer. The Department of Health were anxious to have the FDA approval before we started testing because it was a test that had been developed in the United States, and they considered that it would be very embarrassing if we had started testing using this test and the FDA came along and said, this test is deficient and you cannot use it in the United States. Mr. Brown, I want to look at that, please. Were the Department of Health similarly anxious to restrict introduction of the second generation until it had FDA approval? Answer, no, they were not. Question, why not? Why was there any difference? Answer, because we had done considerable testing of the second generation. Question, if you had done considerable testing of the first generation assay, the Department of Health would have been satisfied? Answer, that may well have been so. And can we go back as well to pick something up he says on on page 25 about the second, if we go to 1240, he started that answer explaining what the FDA approval is and why it's required. And then he says at 1240, indeed, with the second generation test, we did not wait for FDA approval. And indeed, it was very late in the United States. And they were using the second generation considerably after it had been used extensively in Europe. Another document that I wish to draw your attention to in relation to the condition about that we saw imposed at the November 1989 meeting regarding introduction of HCV testing, about confirmatory testing, is NHBT 0071870_002. Which is a minute of the National Directorate of the MBTS National Management Committee, 4th January 1990, with Dr. Gunson in the chair. And if we could go, please, to page 5. This is in the section of the meeting where they are discussing the pilot trial on anti-Hcv testing. If we could go to 5th paragraph down, starts with regard to the absence of a confirmatory test. Dr. Gunson advised that the committee that the ACVSB did not see this necessarily as a barrier to the introduction of routine screening, but the ACVSB would insist that any test for routine use must have been licensed by the FDA. Some progress has been made towards a confirmatory test using the same antigen in blot form, and this may well be available at the end of January. So it's a slightly different complexion put in by Dr. Gunson to what's recorded in the minute of that November 89 meeting, where it seemed to suggest that it was, in fact, a precondition of introduction of HCV testing, that there should be a confirmatory test. Something slightly different is being said here, and it's not clear which is a more inaccurate summary of what was said at that meeting. We understand from Dr. Gunson's statement in the litigation, in hepatitis C litigation, which you don't need to turn up now that the pilot study was completed and reported to the ACVSB at the meeting on the 17th of January 1990, and we can see that minute of that meeting. We don't need to turn that up, but PRSE 301477. I just want to turn back to the oral evidence given by Dr. Gunson in A and others to see what he said the major steps were in the chronology of hepatitis C testing. So we go back to NHBT 40148_001. So we're on the same day, cross-examination, 26th of October. If we turn, please, to page 52.
Yes, I think you said earlier that Mr. Brown was representing the defendants. Plainly, he wasn't. If this is cross-examination.
Yes, sorry. So he's taught. So if we go to line 2568, and the question is, when do you say, Dr. Gunson, that the ACVSB decided in principle, because that was their task, to recommend the introduction of routine screening? I think that in principle was in November 1989. That's what we've already looked at. A question, thank you. When do you say they made their final decision, as it were, subject to go-ahead? Answer, July 1990, subject to a pilot trial. And then if we go over to page 53, if we pick it up at 2610 or 2609, so when did you say the decision in principle was made? I said the decision in principle that we must test was November 1989. And then at 2615, the judge says, I have 3 dates on Dr. Gunson's evidence: November 1989 in principle, July 1990 go-ahead subject to the pilot trial, November 1990 final decision. And Mr. Brown says, I am content with that summary, my lord. And Dr. Gunson, as the witness, doesn't intervene and say, no, that's wrong. So it's a little bit difficult to follow this, his evidence, but my understanding of that is that is what his evidence was in terms of the major milestones. So just for reference, that meeting in July 1990, we don't need to turn it up, is PRSE 40976.
Well, just a moment or two ago, you told me, I think, that the a pilot study was completed and reported in January 1990. Yes. This date suggests that the ACVSB decided to go ahead in July 1990, subject to the pilot trial.
So this is a second pilot, and then we'll come on to the third.
So is this the second pilot for the second generation?
No, this is the second pilot. So by the meeting in July 1990, there was FDA approval of the Chiron test.
I think it might help at some stage, perhaps as a supplement to the presentation, if a chronology is set out as to what's happened.
Yes.
Because it's not entirely easy to follow, dotting backwards and forwards from amongst the documents.
Yes.
And I'm concerned that everyone should be able to track it through.
Yes. So at the July 1990 meeting, the FDA approval had been granted for hepatitis screening, and the trial that was given the go-ahead, if you like, at that meeting was the trial to establish which was the better of the 2 tests that were available at the time, the Ortho or the Abbott test. And there was discussion about whether or not the Wellcome test would be able to join that trial. So that's the trial that that Dr. Gunson is referring to in his evidence in July 1990. And then the final decision, as he puts it, in November 1990, we might just look at it. It's NHBT 5073_018. And that we can see is the ACVSB meeting 21 November 1990. And we can see that Dr. Gunson is an attender. And if we turn over to page 2, there's an entry in Hepatitis C Testing. And we go to paragraph 6. Dr. Gunson introduced his paper on the results of the pilot study, saying that the results of the supplementary testing would be the decisive factor when considering whether one screening test was better than the other. Both screening tests could be deemed to be satisfactory for routine use within RTCs from an operational viewpoint, and their choice would be influenced by the equipment available in the RTC. And paragraph 7, Dr. Tedder is speaking, and he says, halfway through that paragraph, overall there seemed little to choose between the two screening kits. What they're discussing there is that second trial of the difference between the two tests. And then if we go over to page 3, we can see what Dr. Gunson articulated as the final decision to go ahead with testing. And we see that at paragraph 10. The committee agreed that it was important to start screening as soon as practicable as a measure which would further enhance the blood supply. And then there's discussions about counselling and so on. Can we then turn to what Dr. Gunson says in his litigation statement for the hepatitis C litigation, which is...
So can I just understand this? This meeting is when? This is November?
November 1990.
And November 1990, they've decided that of the two tests which they've been examining, either would do. They're both satisfactory tests to be used to see whether, or to screen out a real risk to blood transfusion recipients. And the committee says, get on with it as soon as practicable. Yep. And it wasn't introduced until 9 months later, 10 months later.
Yes, so I'm quite so. So I'm just going to show you some documents, because as you can imagine, Dr. Gunson was asked questions about that in the litigation.
Yes. So what can you take us to what he had to say about that?
Yes. So the first period of what might be described as delay, or was put to him as being delay then, he deals with in his witness statement. So that is... sorry, I'm on the wrong page. NHBT 5026_009. Page 34 to begin with, please. Paragraph 82. 81, so he describes effectively the meeting 21st November, final decision was made to proceed with HCV testing. And he says this, although that decision had to be confirmed by ministers, and I was not informed that approval had been received until shortly before 22nd of January 1991. The issues thereafter related to implementation. And he goes on to say at paragraph 85, which is page 36, he describes how he was informed on 22nd January 91, having been notified on the telephone by Mr. Canavan of the Department of Health that ministers had approved the introduction of routine screening. I wrote to all RTDs and asked for the earliest date on which testing could begin at each RTC. And we do have a letter from Dr. Gunson written, so he says, on the same day that he was informed that the go-ahead had been given by the Department for Screening to all RTDs, asking them precisely that question. And that letter, and there's no need to go to it, Ms Richards went to it yesterday, but for reference, that letter is NHBT 5076_006. And we see, indeed, Dr. Gunson writing more letters to the Regional Transfusion Centre directors in February of 1991. He writes one on the 5th of February 91. Again, we don't need to go to that, but for reference, it's NHBT 5062_027, suggesting at that stage that the screening should start in June, and then 10 days later, on the 15th of February, suggesting that it might start in July, and that is NHBT 40191_077, and we don't need to go to that. Certainly there is activity by Dr. Gunson in trying to get the screening programme up and running shortly after once he's heard from the department. The next document that I want to go to try and explain this timing point is NHBT 5073_063, and it's a document that Ms Richards went to yesterday, but it's a significant document in terms of the chronology. And we can see that it's a minute of the ACTTD, and we can see that Dr. Gunson is in the chair. And if we go, please, to page 2 of that, we can see at 4.11 that the proposed starting date of 1st July presented difficulties since it was considered essential that the second generation test from both Ortho and Abbott should be evaluated prior to the commencement of routine tests. So here we have what seems to be a third evaluation, and this is the second generation evaluation. And that decision is made at that ACTTD committee. And you may recall, sir, yesterday we looked at the difference between the two committees, the ACVSB and the ACTTD, and the ACTTD was dealing with operational issues.
Well, you say the decision was made, the decision to recommend was made.
Yes, sir.
Because
yes.
The various committees we've been looking at are all recommendations, aren't they?
Yes. So I think that's correct, although this is... I think that is correct, sir, although this committee is dealing with operational matters.
Well, it's an advisory committee.
Yes.
That's its title.
Yes, yes. And we see that is communicated, that decision is communicated to the RTCs on the 3rd of April, 1991. And if we look at that helps us. That is NHBT 5073_065. And precisely as you say, sir, the way that's articulated, it's to all regional transfusion directors from Dr. Gunson. It's an update from his letter from 15th February when he suggested that the date might be 1st of July. And then he says in the third paragraph, the Department of Health has agreed that there should be a second round comparative evaluation of anti-HCV test kits at Newcastle, North London and Glasgow. So the first round comparative evaluation was the June 1991. There was, of course, preceding that, the pilot trial in 89. So this is called the second round comparative evaluation, and it's of the second generation tests. So he there in that letter suggests that the start date for screening will therefore be put back to 1st of September 1991. Now, we get a little bit more about how this came about in the oral evidence that Dr. Gunson gave in the Hepatitis C litigation. So if we can turn back to the transcript, please, and this time can we go to NHBT 40146_001. This is evidence he's giving on Tuesday, the 24th of October. And so this is evidence in chief. So he's being asked questions by his own.
Well, I think, is it in chief? Or is it re-examination?
No, it is
in chief, is it?
It's in chief. He was in chief for several days. And if we turn, please, to page 91. And if we start...
well, he says there where the decision was taken at the bottom of the page, doesn't he? To answer the question which I was asking you
quite.
Shortly before.
He says orally, it was a decision that it was put to him, the decision to postpone to 1st September was not taken, this is right at the bottom, 4547. It's put to him, now that decision to postpone was not taken either at the ACVSB or the ACTDD, was it? And he says, no, it was taken after a discussion between myself and Dr. Pickles. And then over the page, who phoned whom? I think I phoned her. A question, and the gist of your discussion was, answer, it looks as though we are going to have a problem completing these tests by 1st July. Perhaps we ought to consider a later date. And I suggested 1st September, to which she agreed and sent a memo to Dr. Metters, who was her chief, because it was she I was discussing it with, because he was on holiday at the time. And then the judge says, well, there were two decisions there then, Dr. Gunson. I want to be clear about this. There are two decisions. The first decision is, it is an essential precondition of starting routine screening that there be prior tests on the second generation equipment. Secondly, consequence upon that, it is decided to postpone from 1st July to 1st September. Now, you've told us about the second decision, but who took and how and when the first decision, which does not appear, as you've told us, either to have been the express subject of discussion at either of those two meetings? And the answer, it came, I think, in that discussion I had with Dr. Pickles, how advisable it would be, and I think it then got to essential. It was sort of drift. So that's what he says in evidence. But of course, having looked at the minute of the March 1991 ACTDD meeting, that doesn't quite. That's not quite.
Just at the bottom of the page, Mr. Underhill, who was representing the Department of State, I think.
Yes.
Said, this is 4576. I'm concerned both about the time and indeed the stance that, as your Lordship knows, I've adopted as regards the evidence of things that happened after 1st of April. The date of 1st of April is significant for what reason? Was that the date from which the department accepted it certainly should have been introduced or not?
So, yes, so yes, I think that's right, because I'm going to come on to look at the admissions made by Dr. Gunson in his evidence, but what I haven't traced through is what that meant in terms of the legal case. I'm not sure without checking what date they actually plumped for, but that would make sense. That would fit with...
It may be useful for this inquiry, at any rate, to know what, if any, concessions, albeit in the context of this litigation, were made as to the timing at which it is accepted, or was accepted then at any rate, that screening for all blood donations across the UK should have been introduced.
And I'm certainly going to look at what Dr. Gunson said about that and the admissions he makes, because he talks about it in his written statement and orally.
Thank you.
But just on that point about who made the decision in principle that second generation testing was essential. Well, we've seen that the advice given by the ACTTD to the department set out in that 25th March 91 minute. And then we've got this evidence from Dr. Gunson saying, well, the department made the decision. He and Dr. What we actually says is he and Dr. Pickles, I think, made it together with a memo to Dr. Metters. And then between him and Dr. Pickles, they decided to move it from 1st July to 1st September in a telephone call. I just want to draw your attention, sir, to some other aspects of this evidence, oral evidence, and pick up the point about the admission. Just before we get on to the admission, if we could go, please, if we could just look, sticking on this page, can we just see what Dr. Gunson says so he's asked at page 4589, line 4589, which centres did the testing start before 1st September? And he's asked to discount Newcastle. Newcastle, sir, as you are, I'm sure, aware, was the centre where Dr. Lloyd was the regional transfusion director, and we heard from Miss Richards yesterday that he started testing early. So discounting Dr. Lloyd, and the answer is it's in my paragraph 94 of his written statement. It began at 4 English centres around the beginning of June, which are Leeds, Liverpool, Sheffield and Bristol, and in the Scottish centre at Glasgow. So that's obvious. That will be an issue that we'll come back to in the forthcoming hearings. And then on the admission point, if we can if we can go, please, first of all to Dr. Gunson's witness statement, which is at NHBT 5026_009, and see how he deals with it there. He says, if we could go, please, to page 41. And paragraph 95. Given the date at which the decision to proceed was taken, with which I have dealt above, and given the importance reasonably attached to adopting a common start date for HCV screening, I am sure that a start date could not reasonably have been set much before 1st July 91. There was a great deal of work for the RTCs to do before screening could have been effectively introduced. The further postponement to 1st September 91 was the consequence of the decision to carry out a trial of the second generation assays. I am sure that the decision was reasonable, given the deficiencies of the first generation test and the absence of any independent evaluation of its successor. But I accept that it would have been possible to adhere to the earlier date, which I take to mean 1st July 91, using the second generation test and collecting data from all RTCs until the second generation tests had been fully evaluated. With hindsight, I think that it would have been better if we had done so. However, it would only have meant that tests would have been introduced 2 months earlier, and in 5 English centres that had occurred in any event. And then, for the sake of completeness, I think it's important, sir, to draw your attention to what he says in paragraph 82 of this witness statement, which is in relation to the decision on the 21st of November 1990, which has been described as the final decision. and this is at page 34. Go to paragraph 82. I do not believe that the decision of 21st November 1990 was one which ought to have been made earlier. The factors which influenced the ACVSB in not making a final recommendation earlier appear from the minutes, but I should emphasise in particular the related problems of false positives, confirmatory testing and donor counselling. And then he goes into detail about those issues, which I'm not going to go to now. Just note, again, we don't need to turn to it, that those, I'm calling them admissions in the loosest sense of the word, but those concessions, I think would be a better way to put it, that Dr. Gunson made are consistent with a letter that he later wrote, or that he wrote on the 16th of February 1999, and to a solicitor at Davis Arnold Cooper. We don't need to turn that up, but for your note, it's NHBT 00 88808. And then if we can now just turn to how Dr. Gunson dealt with that orally, if we can turn back, please, to NHBT 40418_001. Yes, NHBT 40148. Oh, I gave you the wrong number. Got it down wrong. Again, we're back on the examination by Mr. Brown on the 26th of October. And could we please turn to page 24. So, Mr. Brown at 1178. He says, I want to try the roundup question, Dr. Gunson. You had come back from Rome and made a recommendation. You did not make your recommendation to the deciding body. There was about 6 weeks, or indeed close to 2 months after you got back from Rome. Answer, it is the first time they met after I got back from Rome. Question, let us assume that the body had arranged to meet immediately after this very important conference. Can we assume that, please? Yes. Question, let us also assume that before Rome, we in this country had done what the French had done and had run some extensive pilots. Answer, yes. May I say France is really the only country that reported at Rome to have done that? Question. I understand that, but you were striving, as your statement of objectives makes plain, to maintain the highest standard and ensure the maximum safety. So I am imposing upon you your own standards. Dr. Gunson, let us assume first that the committee had met immediately after this very important conference. Secondly, that we had done some extensive pilots before that conference. You go over there. Third, that Dr. Cash and Dr. Gillen had got their act together about drawing up donor counselling documentation. Fourth, that people like Dr. Lloyd had approached their local funders to say, we will need some money. Fifth, that everyone had said, well, we will have to wait for the excise licence, the export licence, but we do not have to wait for FDA approval. And sixth, and this is the one where we will perhaps part company, and I identify it for you, Dr. Gunson, everyone has been prepared to say, we think there is a confirmatory test just on the horizon. It is desirable, but it is not necessary to have it on the same day. If I make all of those assumptions, we could have started, could we not, at the turn of the year? Answer, with those assumptions, yes. And he then goes on to give some evidence in relation to FDA approval, which I think we've looked at. And then if we pick it up, please, at page 27, at the bottom of page 27. Mr. Brown, 1344. The only other matter that you identify, making all the assumptions I did about the best will in the world and moving forward and trying to maintain the obligations you set yourself, subject to the need or the desirability for a confirmatory assay, one could have introduced it at the turn of the year. Answer: if the transfusion centres had been able to do so. Question: we have looked at why they could not. It is questions of funding, goodwill, matters of that kind. They had not moved earlier. Answer: building possibly. Mr. Justice Burton: what do you mean, if? Because you are the man who would know. Answer: when I inquired a year later, my lord, 2 centres were carrying out building work prior to the necessary before introducing the test. So the previous year, that building work may well have been required. Mr. Justice Burton: can you see if you can, giving all the experience you have to it, and of course knowing that at that stage you had not been long in place, give an estimate as to whether, in fact, leaving aside the 6th point, which Mr. Brown is going to ask you about, practicalities would have been such that on balance of probability, all or most of the centres could have had it in place at the beginning of the year? Answer: my lord, I think I said some days ago that in retrospect you could put forward an argument that we could have started earlier. Mr. Brown: by earlier, you mean possibly as early as the beginning of the year? Answer: that I would not like to be committed on, but certainly early in 1990.
So the year that they've been talking about is 1990?
Yes. So then moving on to the issue that Ms. Richards addressed you on yesterday, that the Dr. Lloyd breaking ranks issue and starting testing in his centre earlier than the agreed date earlier than the agreed date on 1st September 91. I don't propose to take you to many of the documents, and indeed Ms. Richards took you to some of them yesterday, and we will be exploring those issues, those documents in later hearings. I just do want to take you to one document, which is the response from Dr. Gunson to Dr. Lloyd when he discovered what had happened, and that is at NHBT 5074_008. And this is 29th April 1991 to Dr. Lloyd from Dr. Gunson. And it says, he sets out the history. He says, at the second paragraph, I was sorry to learn that you'd taken this unilateral decision to proceed with testing without first discussing the issue, not only with me but with your colleagues in other RTCs, given you must have been aware of the implications for them of your decision. And then he sets out, he says that at the ACVSB meeting on 21 January 91, it was agreed that the UK should introduce a testing for anti-Hcv as soon as practical, and the importance of a common starting date for introduction through the UK was stressed. And then he sets out the history, saying to Dr. Lloyd, I've been keeping you abreast of what's been going on and explaining to you why the date has kept being put back. And then if we pick it up over the page, at the 4th paragraph down, I have written these details in some length to demonstrate that I had kept you fully informed of the national policy with respect to anti-Hcv testing. There are still other matters which have not yet been concluded. These principally concern confirmatory tests, the situation with respect to PCR tests, information given to donors prior to testing, and the counselling of donors. Later this week, I'm sending to all RTDs the minutes of the UK Advisory Committee on Transfusion-Transmitted Diseases, in which these matters are discussed as part of the consultative process. And then, skipping out the next paragraph, then you gave me several reasons over the telephone why you did not consider that you could follow national policy in this matter, and I will be grateful if you could put these in writing to me, and we will pick up the response from Dr. Lloyd in due course. And the report there the information coming out of the ACTDD as set out by Dr. Gunson in that letter. I don't think we need to go to it, but it's for reference. It's NHBT 0002876, and that sets out, it's a compendium of recommendations setting out recommended practice to be implemented by the regional transfusion centres the following month, and it covers detailed consideration of management and counselling of donors and the evaluation of confirmatory tests and so on. So there's just one more document that I want to take you to in relation to HCV, and that's on prevalence, or at least Dr. Gunson's views on prevalence. And that is PRSE 302161. In fact, we're not really interested. I'm not really interested in this. This is the proposal for the multi-centre trial study of surrogate testing, and it's actually an annex to this that I want to take you to. So if we could go, please, to page 10 of that document, and we can see there Appendix 1, and it's called alanine amino transferase ALT and hepatitis B core anti-HBC screening of blood donations. And if we go, please, over to page 14, we can see that at page 5, at the bottom there, page 5 of that appendix, right at the bottom, we've got Dr. Gunson, October 1986. So if we could please go back to page 1. So what he is doing in this paper is setting out his views on the prevalence of hepatitis C, or non-A, non-B. And I'll go through it in a little bit of detail, but of course that's one of the questions for the inquiry, and no doubt this issue will be considered in due course on a number of occasions, including by the expert group of statisticians. So what Dr. Gunson is looking at is, first of all, prevalence, and secondly, flowing from that, the cost to the donor population from the introduction of surrogate testing. Looking first of all at prevalence, he does a review of the literature, and in the last paragraph of this first page, he looks at this is page 10. Sorry. That's why I'm telling you the wrong page. It's the first page of the annex, I meant. Sorry. Thank you. Last page, the last paragraph of the first page of the appendix, he reviews the literature such as it is on prevalence of non-A, non-B in the UK. And he considers the MRC study from between 1968 and 1971, and he considers a much smaller study of 248 patients undergoing cardiac surgery who received an average of just over 6 units of blood. And he concludes, he finds in there that the MRC study has an incidence of 2.5, an overall incidence, if we can see 4 lines up from that paragraph, the overall incidence of 2.5%, and he concludes that the Collins study, the smaller cardiac study, has an 3 lines up, an incidence of 3.2%. If we go then over to page 13, we can see his conclusions, and I've gone to that paragraph to try and understand his conclusions. Matters for consideration, number 1, incidence of transfusion-associated non-A, non-B hepatitis in the UK. The best estimate of incidence from published data is 3%. Now, I don't know where that figure comes from. I'm surmising that it comes from somewhere between 2.5 and 3.2, but I don't know.
And by incidence there, what is he talking about? The incidence of the hepatitis after transfusion, or is he talking about the incidence in the population, the donor population?
Again, I don't know. But he is saying, it's under 1, incidence of transfusion-associated non-A.
Yes, I follow the heading.
Yes.
But what he's been talking about as ranging between 2.5% and just over 3% from the studies of Collins and others is population prevalence, isn't it? Have I got that wrong?
Can we just go back, please, to page 10? Yes, so incidence, so the first line there, it's difficult to estimate the incidence of transfusion-associated non-A, non-B hepatitis in the UK. And then he comes to the view, yes, he talks about an overall incidence of 2.5%. I think that's correct. It's difficult to see because the Collins study seems, the way that he's written it seems to suggest it's following transfusion.
Yes.
So
Yes,
you may be looking at two different things.
I think it would be much clearer, I think, if looking at the original papers.
Yes.
But so the figure of 3% may well be after transfusion.
Yes. That I have to say is how I'd read it.
And that would fit with the heading. You're quite right.
And then with what he says afterwards, if one assumes that 2.3 million donations in the UK are transfused to 750,000 recipients annually.
You're reading from the page which isn't in front of us.
Page 13. I'm sorry.
So we need to go back.
Yes, we need to go to page 13. Matters for consideration 1. So we got to the 3%, and then if one assumes that the 2.3 million donations in the UK are transfused to 750,000 recipients annually, possibly a more accurate assessment should and could be made, then one would expect 22,500 icteric or anecteric cases of non-A, non-B hepatitis each year. If the morbidity pattern of the disease is similar to that in the USA, then one might expect half of those patients to have chronic ALT elevation and 10%, i.e. 2,250, to develop cirrhosis. And then he goes on to say, projected value of ALT and anti-HBC screening and prevention of transfusion-associated non-A, non-B hepatitis. If 30 or 40% of non-A, non-B hepatitis could be prevented by the use of the above tests, then the reduction in the number of cases would be 6,750 to 900 per year, and by extrapolation, 675 to 900 cases of cirrhosis. So I think that must mean 9,000, that first 900. And then he sets out some qualifications. And then at para 3 at the bottom, effect on ALT and anti-HBC screening on blood collection. From the evidence available in the UK, one might expect that ALT screening will cause the loss of 0.7 to 0.9% of donations and anti-HBC in the order of 1%. Again, it's not clear how he's come to that figure, but presumably there will be some overlap in the ALT and anti-HBC results, but one might expect a loss of donations of approximately 1.5 to 1.75%. And then over the page, he sets out some qualifications in relation to that. So clearly this is an issue that the inquiry will need to look at very carefully, but I just bring this, sir, to your attention because this appears to be the view of Dr. Gunson on the issue of incidence and impact of surrogate testing as of October 1986. So that I don't intend to draw your attention to any more documents in relation to hepatitis C or non-A, non-B. I do just have one more document which I wish to draw your attention to before concluding this presentation, and that is at DHSC 302941_006. Now, this is a note of a meeting dated 21st of February 1992, and we can see that present at the meeting is entitled HIV-infected blood stroke tissue recipients, and we can see present at the meeting Dr. Rejman and from the DH, including a number of attendees, including Dr. Rejman, and then we've got attendees from the CDSC, and then we've also got Dr. Gunson attending from the NBTS. And this appears to be a meeting that's being held by the Department of Health in contemplation of setting up a scheme to make payments to those who have been infected by blood and blood products with HIV who are not eligible for payments from the Macfarlane Trust. And so we know, sir, from the evidence that we've heard to date that what actually transpired was that the Eileen Trust was set up, but this is a meeting before that, obviously at planning stage. And so the proposed scheme is set out at the top there. A submission currently with Secretary of State seeking agreement to an outlined scheme. Department of Health outline their current thinking and they set out what their intention is. So the intention was to pay as soon as possible a first batch of cases which had already been validated. Then it says payments would be made probably by the department without a handling organisation in view of the difficulties involved in extending the remit of the Macfarlane Trust. And we know that didn't transpire. And then it says a draft application form was tabled for comments. And the form would be signed by a medical sponsor. More than one medical practitioner may be needed to provide information in respect of the transfusion and the HIV status. And then if we go down, please, to the bottom paragraph, a unit would need to be set up, probably in the department, to screen applications. Anything contentious would be referred to the panel. And so you will recall the evidence that we heard in relation to the Eileen Trust was precisely that the department made the decision about eligibility, and only once the department had decided that somebody was eligible for payments under the Eileen Trust did it come to the Eileen Trust. They then talk about the department writing a procedure, and if we pick it up 4 lines from the end, it would be for the panel to decide what further information they required, e.g. PCR testing, and what weight to be put on information about, example, lifestyles in individual cases. DH asked MBTS and CDSC what information was available to them to assist in the validation process. And then if we go over the page, please, we've got, if we pick it up at information available from MBTS halfway down the page. So this is what Dr. Gunson says is available in terms of records. Pre-1985 library samples of donations in RTCs would be very rare. RTCs hold stored samples for the last 2 to 3 years and may have stored samples post-1985. MBTS hold the donation number of all HIV-positive donations, full records of the positive donations held at RTCs. All HIV-positive donors who could be traced, about 90%, have been informed of their HIV positivity and told not to donate again. MBTS would be in a position to find the donation number from the hospital and trace back to the donor. Where a donor moves from one RTC to another, a transfer note should be held to enable the donor to be traced. Difficulties could arise where perhaps as many as 30 units in one transfusion would need to be traced. During 1987, Dr. Tim Wallington of Bristol undertook a look-back study and was able to trace recipients from only 1/3 of the seropositive donors due to resistance from consultants and ethical committees. Clinical opinion about the potential benefits of early diagnosis of HIV was now changing, and this, together with the potential for payments to the patients concerned, should lead to greater cooperation. So, pausing there, Dr. Gunson clearly was of the view that it was the consultants' willingness to cooperate that was the barrier to identifying for a successful look back rather than an absence of records. And then Dr. Gunson raised the question of funding the additional work that providing information for validation of claims would create. So we can see what's being said about what's available, precisely how the system from the government side, precisely how the government, in fact, set up that panel, if indeed they did set up a panel, and how they screened those applications for eligibility for what became the Eileen Trust. We don't know, we haven't heard any evidence in relation to that, but it's clearly a matter that the inquiry will be looking at. So those were the documents that I wish to draw your attention to in oral presentation. As I say, there is a much longer written presentation which will be published on the website in due course that accompanies this oral presentation.
Yes, and that will link together the various documents which you've been showing me.
Indeed, it will, yes.
Yes,
And so we will certainly take up the suggestion to publish a chronology relating to, in particular, hepatitis C testing, because it is complex.
Yes, that will be, I think, very helpful indeed. Well, thank you very much. Now, what's next?
So next week, on Tuesday, we start with the oral evidence from Regional Transfusion Centre directors, and we will start with Dr. Napier, who was the director of the Cardiff Centre, and he will give evidence over Tuesday and Wednesday.
And he will be giving evidence remotely? He will be giving evidence remotely, yes. Very well. Well, in that case, we break now. After I hope you have enjoyed a lunch together, those of you who wish to. And I shall see those of you who come back next week on Tuesday, 10 o'clock, Dr. Napier. Those of you who are watching online, it's 10 o'clock next week, where we start with Dr. Napier's evidence remotely from Cardiff. Thank you very much.